We tell you plainly, at 41 years old, with a boy of 9 clinging to her sleeve and the last of her coins sewn into the hem of her one good dress, Clara Voss had nothing left to lose, because everything had already been taken from her. It was her brother-in-law, Gerrit Voss, who put her out of the house she had shared with his late brother, telling her the roof was his by law now and that a widow with no sons grown enough to work was a mouth he could not feed. She left with $4.60, a tin of her husband's tools, and a boy named Samuel who did not yet understand why they were walking instead of riding. In the town of Larkspur Hollow, Colorado Territory, in the spring of 1889, she spent nearly every cent of what remained $9 she had begged and mended dresses to earn on a collapsing, soot-blackened ruin that the town had laughed about for a decade, the old abandoned blacksmith's forge at the end of Cooper Street, left to rot since its last owner died with no kin and no will. The auctioneer himself called it a fool's purchase. The men on the porch of the mercantile called it worse. But sealed beneath that crumbling floor was something that would not only save Clara Voss and her son from ruin, it would settle a debt the whole town of Larkspur Hollow had forgotten it owed, and bring quiet justice to a man who had spent 20 years believing his sins were buried for good. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Voss. If you are watching this from a place that people have written off as finished, as used up, as not worth the trouble, tell us in the comments, because this story is for you. Clara had not always been a woman who counted pennies on a boarding house cot. She had been raised in Ohio, in a town called Millhaven, the second of 3 daughters born to a blacksmith named Joseph Tanner, a broad, quiet man whose hands were always faintly gray with iron dust and who never once, in Clara's memory, turned away a neighbor who could not pay. Joseph Tanner believed, with the kind of simple conviction that some men carry instead of scripture, that a forge belonged to the whole street, not just the man who owned the deed to the land beneath it. He mended plow blades for the widow Hutchins without charge because her husband had died clearing a field that fed half the township. He shod horses on credit for families who had lost a season to drought, and when those families could finally pay, he often told them the debt had already been settled, by which he meant he had simply decided to forgive it. Clara grew up sweeping iron filings from the floor of that forge, pumping the bellows when her arms were barely strong enough, and listening to her father explain, in his unhurried way, that the true measure of a tool or a person was never its polish, but what it could still do for someone in need. She watched him take rusted, neglected, half-ruined pieces of metal that other smiths would have melted down without a second look, and turn them, with patience and heat and care, into hinges and latches and plowshares that outlasted things bought new. It was, she would later understand, the only inheritance her father ever truly gave her, the conviction that nothing discarded was necessarily worthless, and that value often hid exactly where carelessness had stopped looking. She married young, to a freight teamster named Daniel Voss who had come through Millhaven driving a string of mules and stayed 3 weeks longer than his route required because he could not bring himself to leave without asking her father for her hand. Daniel was not a wealthy man, nor an ambitious one in the way the age demanded, but he was steady, and he was kind, and he believed, as Clara's father had, that a person's worth was not printed on a ledger. They moved west together in 1879, chasing the kind of modest, durable life that freight work promised along the growing rail lines of the Colorado Territory, and in 1880 their son Samuel was born in a rented room above a feed store in a town that no longer exists under that name. Clara learned, in those years, to stretch $1 until it nearly tore, to patch a coat so the patch looked like part of the design, to put up preserves from fruit other women considered too bruised to bother with. She learned, too, a smaller trade from her husband's long winters at home, how to read a ledger, how to balance accounts, how to recognize, in columns of careless handwriting, the places where a number had been quietly changed. It was a skill she would not understand the full value of for nearly a decade. For a time, their life was thin but whole. Daniel hauled freight for the mining outfits pushing into the hills above Larkspur Hollow, and though the work was hard and the pay uncertain, there was a rhythm to it that Clara had come to trust, the way one trusts a horse that has never once thrown its rider. She did not know, in those years, that the rhythm was already cracking beneath them, in the books of a bank 2 towns away, in the slow tightening grip of a man named Hiram Lockwood, whose name she had heard only in passing and whose shadow she did not yet understand would fall across the rest of her life. The fall, when it came, did not arrive as a single blow but as a slow erosion that Clara would spend years trying to understand fully. In the autumn of 1886, Daniel was killed in a rockslide above Larkspur Hollow while hauling timber supports up to a mine that the Lockwood Mining and Trust Company had recently bought a controlling interest in, mine that, Clara would later learn, had been warned twice by its own foreman about unstable footing on that very grade, warnings that Hiram Lockwood's office had dismissed as costly delays. There was no compensation offered to her beyond a single month's wages and a letter of regret typed on company stationery. She buried her husband on a hillside outside town with a wooden marker she carved herself, because she could not afford the stonecutter's price, and she moved with 6-year-old Samuel into a small rented house that Daniel had been paying off in installments through the very same Lockwood Bank. For 2 years she held on, taking in mending and selling preserves and teaching a handful of children their letters for whatever coin or goods their families could spare, but the installments on the house had been structured, she discovered too late, with a balloon payment buried deep in language she had trusted her husband to understand and he had trusted the bank to explain honestly. When the balloon came due in the spring of 1888, she did not have it, and Hiram Lockwood's bank foreclosed with a swiftness that left her certain, though she could never prove it, that the loan had been designed from the start to be unpayable. She moved in with Daniel's brother Garrett out of necessity, and it was there, after a year of swallowing his resentment and his wife's cold silences, that she was finally put out onto the road with her son and almost nothing else, told plainly that a widow who could not pay her way was a burden no honest family was obliged to carry. She walked from that house with her chin level and her son's hand in hers, though inside she felt, for the first time in her life, that the floor of the world itself had simply given way beneath her, the way the hillside had given way beneath her husband. It was on the road south from Garrett's place, in search of any town that might need a seamstress or a teacher or simply another set of willing hands, that Clara and Samuel arrived back in Larkspur Hollow, the very town where Daniel had died, because she still knew its streets and because she could not afford the fare to go anywhere stranger. She took the cheapest room above the laundry that her dwindling money could buy, and it was there, within her first week back, that she heard the auctioneer's bell ringing outside the old Cobb forge at the end of Cooper Street, a squat, blackened building that had stood empty and untouched since its owner, a solitary blacksmith named Elijah Marsh, had died there alone nearly 11 years before, with no children, no widow, and apparently no will that anyone in town had ever located. The county was finally clearing its books of unclaimed properties, and the forge, considered worthless by every measure the town applied to such things, was being sold for whatever the county could get, which on that gray morning turned out to be $9, paid by a destitute widow everyone assumed had simply lost her senses. The men gathered at the mercantile porch laughed about it for days. They said Clara Voss had bought a tomb. They did not know, of course, that the man who had died in that forge had spent the final years of his life as something Larkspur Hollow had entirely forgotten he was. She remembered, walking through the forge's door for the first time as its rightful owner, the particular smell of cold iron and old ash that had filled her father's shop in Millhaven, and for a moment grief and memory tangled so tightly in her chest that she had to stand still in the doorway simply to breathe. The roof had partly fallen in over one corner, letting rain and weeds claim a patch of the dirt floor, but the great stone forge itself, the bellows frame, the anvil too heavy for anyone to have bothered stealing, all stood largely intact beneath years of dust, as though the building had simply been waiting, patiently, for someone to remember it was there. Samuel, who had inherited none of his mother's instinct for sentiment and all of a 9-year-old's practical curiosity, asked almost immediately whether they would starve before they finished fixing the roof. Clara told him, with more confidence than she felt, that they would manage, because she had grown up in a forge just like this one, and because a building that had sheltered honest work for 30 years was not going to be the thing that finally broke her. She spent her first days simply clearing debris, sweeping the ruined corner clean, and assessing what tools Elijah Marsh had left behind, most of them rusted but salvageable, a few of them, to her surprise, still wrapped carefully in oiled cloth as if their owner had intended to use them again the very next morning. It was while clearing the area nearest the forge itself, where the heat of decades of work had baked the dirt floor into something almost like stone, that she noticed a single flagstone set slightly askew from its neighbors, its edge catching just enough afternoon light through the broken roof to draw her eye. She knelt, more from a smith's daughter's instinct for noticing what did not sit flush than from any premonition, and worked her fingers into the gap until the stone shifted, far more easily than its weight should have allowed. Beneath that flagstone, in a shallow recess lined with the same oiled cloth that had protected the tools, Clara found a small iron strongbox, its hinges stiff but unbroken, and inside it, resting atop a folded canvas pouch heavy enough to make her arms ache when she lifted it, a single sealed letter addressed, in a careful, deliberate hand, to whoever should one day own this forge after him. She did not open the canvas pouch that first evening. Something in her, perhaps the same instinct that had made her father teach her patience over haste, told her the letter ought to come first. She read it by lamplight at the small table she and Samuel had set up in the one dry corner of the building, her son already asleep on a pallet beside her, and what she read changed, slowly and irrevocably, the shape of everything she had assumed about the man whose ruin she had purchased for $9. Elijah Marsh wrote that he had been the blacksmith of Larkspur Hollow for nearly 30 years, and that for the last 15 of them, he had also served, quietly and without ever telling a soul outside a small circle of trusted founders, as the keeper of what the early mining families of the valley had called the Hollow Fund, a mutual aid chest into which the original prospectors and settlers of Larkspur Hollow had agreed, in the hard years of the late 1850s and 1860s, to set aside a portion of their gold dust and coin, not for any one family's benefit, but to be held in trust against disaster, a mine collapse that left children fatherless, a winter that took a family's cattle, a fire that burned a household to the ground. The fund had been entrusted to Marsh, the letter explained, because a blacksmith's forge was the one building in town no one thought to suspect of holding wealth, and because Marsh himself, childless and unmarried, had no heirs whose ambition might one day be tempted to spend what was never his to spend. For years, Marsh wrote, he had quietly used portions of that fund exactly as intended, paying out small sums to widows and injured miners under the pretense of forgiven blacksmiths' debts, so that no one receiving the help ever needed to know precisely where it came from, and so that his own ledger of disbursements, hidden alongside the gold, could one day prove every cent had gone where it was meant to go. But in the final years of his life, he wrote, a man newly arrived in the valley named Hiram Lockwood had begun buying up mining claims and extending loans to struggling families with a swiftness and aggression that troubled him deeply, and Marsh had grown afraid that if the existence of the Hollow Fund ever became widely known while he was the only living soul who could account for it, a man like Lockwood would find some legal or illegal means to seize it for himself, dressing the theft up as a debt owed or a claim purchased. So Marsh had told no one, not even the town council, exactly how much remained, and had resolved instead to leave the fund sealed beneath his own floor, trusting that whoever inherited his forge honestly, by whatever strange turn of fate, would also inherit the responsibility of finishing what he had started, restoring it, when the time was right, to the people of Larkspur Hollow who had built it together and forgotten, over the passing years, that it had ever existed at all. Clara sat for a long while after reading those words, the lamp burning low, her son's breathing soft and even in the dark beside her, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened her slightly, that the fortune the letter described was not, by any honest reading, hers to keep. It belonged, as it always had, to the descendants of the families whose names filled the careful ledger she found folded beneath the gold itself, names that included, she noticed with a jolt that made her hand tremble, her own late husband's family, the Vossas, who had been among the valley's first homesteaders, and even, scrawled in a different hand entirely near the ledger's final pages, a notation that chilled her, a record, dated some 20 years earlier, of an attempt by a man identified only by the initials HL to purchase Marsh's forge and the land beneath it for a price far above its worth, an offer Marsh had refused without ever stating why, and one which, the ledger noted in Marsh's own careful hand, had been renewed twice more in subsequent years with increasing pressure before finally ceasing altogether. It did not take Clara long, once she began quietly asking questions around Larkspur Hollow under the cover of simple curiosity about the forge's old owner, to confirm that HL could be no one but Hiram Lockwood himself, now the most powerful man in the valley, owner of its bank, its largest mining interests, and, as it happened, the very institution that had foreclosed on her own home 2 years before. She did not announce her discovery. She did not, in those first weeks, even tell Samuel the full truth of what lay buried beneath their floor, only that they had found something that meant they would not starve, and that she needed time to think carefully about what to do with it. She began instead the slow, deliberate work of repairing the forge itself, using a portion of the coin, not the bulk of it, but enough to be honest about its source without revealing its scale, to patch the roof, mend the bellows, and reopen Elijah Marsh's old trade under her own hands, shoeing horses and mending tools for whoever in town was willing to trust a woman at the anvil. She did this, in part, because she needed the cover of ordinary, visible labor while she decided how to restore the rest of the fund without drawing the kind of attention that had frightened Marsh into silence for 15 years, and in part because she found, to her own quiet surprise, that the work itself steadied her, that the rhythm of hammer on hot iron was the closest she had felt to her father in over a decade. It did not take long for Hiram Lockwood to notice that the Voss widow had reopened the old Marsh forge, nor for his curiosity to sharpen into something closer to alarm once he learned, through the casual gossip of men who traded at his bank, that she had been seen repairing the building with coin no one could quite account for. Lockwood was, by 1889, a man who had built a reputation for genial respectability in Larkspur Hollow, sitting on the church board, funding the schoolhouse's new bell, lending his name generously to any public cause that cost him little and returned him much in the currency of trust. But beneath that respectability, as Clara had begun to suspect from the ledger and would soon confirm through harder means, lay a man who had spent 2 decades quietly absorbing the small claims and modest homesteads of families he had maneuvered into debts they could not escape, the Voss family's own forfeited home being only the most recent and, to him, the most forgettable of many. When Lockwood learned that the forge he had once tried 3 times to purchase from Elijah Marsh, for reasons he had never fully explained even to himself beyond a persistent, gnawing suspicion that the old blacksmith was hiding something of value, had been sold out from under him for $9 to a penniless widow, his alarm curdled quickly into a determination to correct what he saw as a clerical oversight rather than a fair sale. He came to the forge himself on a bright morning in early summer, dressed in the dark, well-cut coat that had become his particular signature in the valley, and offered Clara, with the smooth courtesy of a man accustomed to having his offers accepted, a sum for the forge and its land that was generous by any honest measure but transparently, almost insultingly small set against what he suspected might lie beneath its floor. When Clara declined, politely but without hesitation, Lockwood's courtesy thinned visibly, and he reminded her, in tones meant to sound helpful rather than threatening, that county property records from that era were notoriously imperfect, that liens and prior claims sometimes surfaced years after a sale to complicate an owner's title, and that a woman alone, with a young son to provide for, might find it wiser to take a fair price now than risk a legal entanglement later that she could ill afford to fight. Clara understood the threat plainly enough beneath its velvet wording, and she understood, too, with a coldness that surprised her, that this was very likely the same tone, dressed in different words, that Lockwood's bank had used to maneuver her own husband's family and a dozen others into ruin over the years. She told him, with the steady composure her father had once used to forgive an unpayable debt, that she would need time to consider his offer, and she watched him leave with the unmistakable certainty that he intended to find another way to take what he wanted if Patience did not deliver it to him first. Over the following weeks, Lockwood's pressure grew less subtle. He sent his bank's attorney to question the county clerk about irregularities in the original auction, irregularities that did not exist but might, with sufficient insistence, be manufactured into a credible-seeming legal cloud over Clara's title. He let it be known, through the careful seeding of conversation at his bank's counter, that the Voss widow's sudden coin for repairs raised questions about where, precisely, a destitute woman had found such funds, planting a suggestion of impropriety that Clara could feel settling over certain townspeople's glances even before any words were spoken aloud. It was Samuel, of all people, who first told her plainly that some of the other children at the schoolhouse had begun repeating things their fathers said about her, that she had perhaps found something at the forge that wasn't rightfully hers, and Clara understood then that Lockwood intended to win not through the courts alone but through the slower, crueler mechanism of a town suspicion, the same mechanism that had once made it easy for everyone to believe a friendless widow had simply lost her senses buying a worthless ruin. She decided, in the face of that pressure, that the only way to protect both the fund and her own standing was to do the very thing Elijah Marsh had spent 15 years too frightened to attempt, bring the truth into the open herself, on her own terms, before Lockwood could shape it into a lie that suited him. She went first not to the town council, whose members she did not yet trust to be free of Lockwood's influence, but to the one person in Larkspur Hollow she knew had no love for the banker and every reason to listen carefully, a widow named Margaret Ashby, whose husband had died in the same mine collapse that had killed Daniel Voss, and who had spent the years since fighting, with little success, to have the mining company acknowledge its negligence. Clara showed her the ledger, and watched Margaret's face change as she found, among its careful entries, a record of a small disbursement made to her own family 8 years before, listed only as a forgiven blacksmith's debt, a kindness she had never understood the true source of until that moment. With Margaret Ashby's support, and the quiet, gathering testimony of several other families whose names appeared in Marsh's ledger as recipients of help they had never been able to explain, Clara called for an open meeting at the schoolhouse, inviting the entire town, including, deliberately, Hiram Lockwood himself, to hear what she had to say about the history of the forge she now owned. She stood before that gathered room, her son seated quietly in the front row, and read aloud, in full, Elijah Marsh's final letter, the origins of the Hollow Fund, and the long, careful list of contributions and disbursements he had kept for 15 years in secret. She did not accuse Lockwood directly of wrongdoing in that moment, for she had no proof beyond a single set of initials that would satisfy a courtroom, but she laid out, plainly and without embellishment, the dates of his 3 attempts to buy the forge from Marsh decades before, and let the room draw its own conclusions about why a man with no apparent interest in blacksmithing had pursued a failing forge so persistently for so many years. She watched, as she spoke, the faces around her shift from suspicion of her towards something closer to shame at how easily they had been led to doubt a widow instead of questioning the wealthy man who had quietly profited from so many of their hardships, and she watched Lockwood himself sit increasingly still in the back row, his composure visibly fraying under the weight of a town's collective memory finally connecting threads he had spent years keeping carefully separate. What followed was not the dramatic unmasking of a villain dragged off in chains, for Lockwood was too careful and too well connected to be brought down by a single meeting in a schoolhouse, but it was, in its way, a justice as complete as Clara could have hoped for. The town council, shamed into action by the open testimony of so many families, formally recognized the Hollow Fund as a community trust rather than personal property, with Clara herself named, at Margaret Ashby's insistence and the room's near-unanimous agreement, as its new caretaker, bound by the same ledger and the same principles Elijah Marsh had quietly upheld for 15 years. Lockwood's 3 failed attempts to purchase the forge, now a matter of public record and public memory, made it impossible for him to pursue any further legal challenge to Clara's title without inviting exactly the kind of scrutiny into his own past dealings that he had spent decades avoiding, and within the year, facing a slow but unmistakable erosion of the trust his respectability had depended on. He quietly sold his controlling interest in the valley's bank and mining concerns and left Larkspur Hollow for good, his name fading from the town's daily conversation the way a stain fades from cloth left long enough in honest sunlight. Clara never saw him punished by any court, but she came to understand, watching him go, that some debts are settled not by punishment but by the simple, irreversible loss of a reputation built on other people's ruin. With the fund restored to public trust and her own place in the town secured, Clara spent the gold not on comfort for herself, though she allowed herself and Samuel a modest, honest sufficiency at last, but on the purposes Marsh's ledger had always intended, a small relief payment to the Ashby family and 4 others still struggling under debts incurred after mining accidents, a new well dug for the families on the dry side of Cooper Street, and, perhaps most fittingly, the rebuilding of the schoolhouse roof that had leaked for years, repaired by Clara's own hands at the very forge where she now taught any child curious enough to ask how iron could be coaxed, with patience and heat, into something useful again. She kept the forge running as Marsh had, and as her father before him, mending broken things that other people had given up on, and it became, over the following years, something closer to what it had always secretly been, not a tomb, as the men on the mercantile porch had once laughingly called it, but the quiet, steady heart of a town that had nearly forgotten how much it owed to people no one thought to look at twice. So we return, as we promised, to where we began, a 41-year-old widow, cast out with nothing, who spent her last $9 on a ruin everyone else had written off as worthless. Clara Voss did not buy that forge because she believed in luck, and she did not keep what she found inside it because she believed it was owed to her alone. She kept faith with it because her father had taught her, at a forge much like Elijah Marsh's, that the things people discard most carelessly are often exactly where their forgotten obligations to one another have been quietly waiting, and that a person's worth, like a tool's, is measured not by its shine but by what it can still do for someone in need. The fortune beneath that floor was never truly hidden from Larkspur Hollow, it had only been waiting for someone willing to look past $9 worth of soot in silence to find it, and for someone with the patience to use it not for herself, but for the very community that had once laughed her purchase off as foolish. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Clara's story. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things, and overlooked people, often hold more value than the world is willing to admit. We would love to know, what is a time you found real worth in something, or someone, that everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below, and until next time, stay close.